Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight's story is titled Miss Marple and the Poison in the Blackberry Tart. In the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, a single tart baked for a summer fair becomes the talk of every parlour and tea room. Beneath the gentle rustle of leaves and the hum of gossip, something darker begins to stir. Miss Marple, with her kind eyes and knitting needles, listens more than she speaks. She notices small things: a stain on a napkin, a jar out of place, a tone too sharp for the words spoken. Around her, tea cools, rain patters against the glass, and the hearth gives off its steady warmth. Within that comfort, truth slowly rises like cream to the surface. So, dear listener, where are you listening from this evening? Perhaps somewhere quiet, with a cup of tea and a steady light. Let the fire burn low and your thoughts wander gently into the heart of the village. And now, dear listener, we turn to Chapter 1, where our mystery properly begins. Chapter 1. The Summer Fair at St. Mary. Mead morning drifted in with soft light, and the village green woke with gentle purpose. Bunting tugged at its strings, and tables stacked with cakes stood ready. Miss Marple sat by the tea tent, her knitting quiet in her lap. Children ran with paper flags, and mothers called them back with mild voices. The brass band tuned with careful notes, and a few dogs wagged at ankles. A kettle sighed inside the tent, and steam rose in slender ribbons. Mrs. Bantry waved from the jam store, her hat pinned with a velvet rose. The Reverend walked past with a list in his hand, counting chairs as he went. Miss Marple smiled and watched the lanes fill with calm footsteps. The baking table held neat rows of tarts, and the blackberry ones shone under sugar. Their scent mixed with cut grass, and the air felt sweet and cool. Lucy Harwood arranged napkins and tried to hide her nerves. She was a slight girl with careful fingers, and her uncle owned the bakery. She said he rose before dawn and baked with quiet pride. Today he had entered a blackberry tart with a lattice top. Miss Marple greeted Lucy with a soft word and asked about the weather. Lucy said the clouds would hold for now and looked toward the judges. Mrs. Bantry leaned in and spoke in a lower tone. There was talk of a rival baker who fell ill last night. She said Dr. Haydock had been called, and the cause seemed unclear. Some said it was a summer stomach, and others were not so sure. A bell rang for judging, and people drew near with polite interest. Inspector Craddock, off duty and cheerful, lifted a cup of tea. He said the fair looked well run, and nodded to the vicar. Miss Marple watched the tarts go forward, and noted a small detail. One plate carried a folded napkin with a faint purple stain. She thought it odd because the napkins were fresh from a sealed stack. The judges tasted with small bites and murmured with mild restraint. There was praise for pastry and a note about even bake. Lucy breathed out when they smiled, and her shoulders eased. A few women spoke of the ill baker again, and their voices dropped. The word poison floated and then fell like a stone in grass. Miss Marple looked at their faces and saw worry mix with curiosity. Mrs. Bantry said gossip was unkind, but people were uneasy. She said the ill man had eaten something sweet last evening. Lucy looked down, and her hands folded into a careful knot. Miss Marple asked when Lucy saw her uncle last night, and waited. Lucy said he worked late and locked the shop near 10. She added that a jar of preserves had been misplaced last week. A breeze lifted the bunting, and a cloud moved across the sun. The blackberry scent grew stronger, and the tea tasted slightly sharp. The Reverend announced the winners, and people clapped in a tidy chorus. Lucy did not win, but she took it kindly and thanked the judges. Her uncle arrived with flour on his sleeves, and he smiled at her. He said the fair looked handsome and hoped the rain would wait. Miss Marple noticed his smile fade for a heartbeat and return. She wondered at that quiet pause and the glance he gave the tarts. She said she would try a slice later and folded her knitting away. A little boy ran past with a ticket and dropped a penny near the table. Miss Marple picked it up and felt sticky sugar on its edge. She handed it back, and the boy bowed with proud formality. Mrs. Bantry called for more tea, and Lucy fetched a clean pot. The steam rose, and a faint, fruity note drifted near the spout. Miss Marple tasted and set her cup down with calm care. She asked Lucy about the napkins, and Lucy showed the fresh stack. Miss Marple lifted one corner and saw a smear from an earlier hand. She thought about hands at fairs and how they touched everything. A whisper started near the cake stall and moved like smoke. The ill baker had taken a turn, someone said, and it sounded grave. Dr. Haydock was on his way again, and people fell quiet. Miss Marple looked at the row of blackberry jars on the prize table. One label was crooked and the glue looked freshly pressed. She noted the way light struck the glass and held the thought. A small clue presented itself in the tea tent, modest but clear. A teaspoon lay with a faint purple ring at its base. Miss Marple asked for a fresh spoon, and Lucy changed it without fuss. Lucy thanked her for the calm manner and asked if she liked the fare. Miss Marple said she liked order and kind voices, and today had both. Lucy smiled and then looked toward the lane. A policeman walked in with slow steps and murmured to Inspector Craddock. Craddock straightened and listened, and his cheerful look dimmed. He asked for the vicar, and they stepped to one side. Miss Marple rose with ease and checked her bag for a handkerchief. She moved to the tent entrance and felt the air cool again. She saw the crowd turn and settle into a nervous hush. Mrs. Bantry touched Miss Marple's sleeve and spoke very softly. She asked if Miss Marple had heard the word poison again. Miss Marple said she had heard the word, and not yet the truth. They both watched Lucy carry a fresh plate of biscuits to the table. Lucy moved carefully, and her mouth was set with careful resolve. Miss Marple thought of the jar, the spoon, and the stain. Rain began in a gentle sheet, and the green grew darker in tone. Stalls threw covers over the goods, and people drew close together. The band stopped, and the drummer wiped his hands. Inspector Craddock returned to the tent and asked for a quiet word. He spoke to the Reverend and Dr. Haydock, who had arrived with haste. The doctor's bag sat near a chair, neat and black. Craddock asked Lucy about her uncle and where he had been each hour. Lucy answered plainly and kept her hand steady. She said he baked, cleaned, and left the key with her. Miss Marple stepped near the tea urn and watched the steam drift. She noted a second jar of sugar tucked behind the first. It had a different spoon, and the lid felt rough with crystals. She asked the helper to pass the nearer jar and took a pinch. The grains sparkled and felt correct under the finger. She asked for the other jar and saw finer crystals that clumped. The doctor glanced at her hand and nodded with mild interest. Miss Marple asked if anyone had refilled the sugar during the morning. The helper said Mrs. Hartley had come from the grocer with supplies. Craddock wrote a note and sent a constable to the shop. Miss Marple asked about the ill baker again, and the doctor spoke. He said the symptoms suggested a toxin and not a common stomach upset. Miss Marple considered the jars and the teaspoon with the purple ring. She asked Lucy whether the blackberry filling had been made last week. Lucy said yes, and that the last jar had been mislaid. A small clue sat in the open, patient as a cat. A folded napkin held a faint berry smear with a chalky edge. Miss Marple lifted it and felt a brittle dryness under the colour. She spoke to Craddock in a quiet voice and suggested caution. She said the sugar should be tested by the doctor at once. He agreed and placed a pinch in a small vial. The rain eased and the bunting stirred with a tired shake. People spoke in low tones and watched the tent like a stage. Miss Marple asked Lucy about the rival baker's last visit to the shop. Lucy said he had come 3 days ago for a friendly word. He had asked to borrow a cooling rack and left with a bag. She added that he had praised their blackberry for its perfume. Miss Marple looked toward the cake table and breathed the air. A light scent of almonds mixed with fruit hung near the tins. She asked if anyone had used almond essence that morning. The helper said yes, but only for the sponge at the far end. Miss Marple walked there and lifted the lid a fraction. The scent was sweet and not unkind, yet a touch too strong. Craddock asked the doctor about tests, and the doctor prepared a few drops. He worked with steady hands, and his face held its usual reserve. He said he could not be sure here and would confirm later. Miss Marple asked Lucy about the receipt book at the shop. Lucy said it was old and held in a drawer under the till. She said Mr. Sims delivered preserves and always wrote in a neat hand. Craddock decided to visit the shop and asked Miss Marple to rest. She smiled and said she might walk by later if it were useful. He said her counsel was always welcome and thanked her. The fair tried to resume and people returned to their tasks. Children chased puddles and mothers sighed with tired grace. The band played a short piece and then put away the stands. Miss Marple sat again and poured a half cup of fresh tea. The scent felt gentler now and the steam lifted in a kinder line. She tasted and found no sharpness in the sweetness. A man with a cap spoke near the tent rope and made a small claim. He said he saw someone switch a jar behind the urn. He could not say who because the rain had blurred his view. Miss Marple asked for the time that this had happened and noted it. She asked him to show where he stood and how the light fell. He did so and pointed to the angle of the tent flap. A small clue surfaced again, steady and modest. The lid on the second sugar jar showed a thumb dent with flour dust. The first jar lid was clean and the spoon dry on top. Miss Marple asked Lucy to fetch her uncle for a word. He came with folded arms and a face that hoped for calm. She asked if anyone else held a key to the shop. He said only Lucy and himself, and that he kept a spare at home. His voice was quiet, and his eyes moved toward the lane. He said the rival baker had visited once more yesterday. Craddock returned with the constable and the shop receipt book. The pages rustled and ink lines marked every delivery. Miss Marple turned a page and found an entry with a different slope. It recorded a late jar, paid in coin and collected at dusk. Mr. Sims had not written it because the loops were wrong. Mrs. Hartley had thin letters, and this had a heavy hand. Lucy looked puzzled and said she had not seen such a payment. Her uncle frowned and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Craddock asked if the drawer had ever stuck in the last week. Mr. Harwood said yes, and that a coin had fallen behind the slot. He said he removed it with a knife and shut the till hard. Miss Marple asked if the letter opener was near the drawer. He said yes, and that the pen had broken that same evening. Miss Marple thanked him and looked at the page edge. It held a tiny crease, as if the book had been lifted with care. Rain cleared to a fine mist, and the light softened on the green. People began to pack away, and the fair found a calmer breath. Miss Marple stood and folded her shawl. She spoke quietly to Craddock and set out her small thoughts. The sugar jar had a foreign grain, and the scent near the sponge was strong. The napkin stain held a chalky rim, and the spoon wore a ring. She said jars and books do not move without hands, and hands leave traces. The rival baker had reason to boast and reason to fear a loss. A late payment with a false hand could hide a quiet errand. Craddock listened and looked toward the shop and then the tea tent. He said he would ask the grocer and Mrs. Hartley about the lid and sugar. He would also ask the doctor to test for bitter almonds. Miss Marple nodded and asked Lucy to keep simple habits for a day. She said to use only sealed packets and clean spoons with hot water. She said to keep the napkins in their paper until needed. A last small clue joined the others, plain and homely. The penny the boy had dropped still showed sugar on its edge. It came from the second jar, which had stood nearest the tent flap. Miss Marple looked at the lane where carriage wheels had marked the mud. She thought about the time of the switch and the play of light. She pictured a hand in a cap and a shadow that welcomed confusion. She spoke to Craddock once more and asked him a gentle question. Who had reason to touch the tea things without notice? She asked. He wrote down 2 names and then added a third. The fair closed with tired smiles and voices wished each other rest. Lucy thanked Miss Marple for her kindness and held her hand. Miss Marple said gentleness is useful when haste is not. They walked toward the lane, and the air smelled of wet earth. The bakery door stood ahead, and a small bell waited to ring. Miss Marple paused and looked back at the quiet green. She thought about pride and how it hides in sugared crusts. She thought about fear and how it moves in small changes. She thought about justice and how it walks at an even pace. She said to Lucy that good bread rises with patience, and so does truth. Lucy smiled and said she would hold to that. The bell at the bakery door gave a thin, proper note. Inside, trays cooled, and the clock ticked with modest certainty. Miss Marple asked to see the drawer and the broken pen. Lucy brought both and placed them on the counter. The pen nib showed a burr, and the letter opener had a faint stain. The drawer stuck near the coin slot and then eased with pressure. Miss Marple looked pleased with the clarity of small facts. She advised Lucy to rest and to trust simple routines tonight. She said Craddock would return with fair questions, and she would be near. Lucy thanked her and folded a cloth with neat corners. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead, and lamps woke in cottage windows. Rain made a hush on the road, and gardens breathed clean air. Miss Marple walked home with steady steps and a quiet heart. She set her knitting on the side table and warmed a cup by the grate. She noted the pattern she had kept and saw where it wished to go. She thought how patterns in wool and life share one patient language. Her mind arranged the clues with the rhythm of a hymn. Sugar that clumped, a spoon with a ring, a crooked label, a false hand in a book, and the soft scent of almonds. The world turned toward night, and the village found its breath again. Miss Marple closed the curtains and set out the teapot for morning. She felt that the first thread had been found. She knew sorrow had touched one house and fear another. She knew gossip would run until guided to a slower path. She knew that patience, kind and firm, would yield the next truth. Chapter 2. Rumours over afternoon need. The rain began early, falling fine as mist across St. Mary Mead. Roofs gleamed dark, and the lanes shone like ribbons of glass. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter and walked toward Mrs. Bantry's house. Inside, the drawing-room smelled of toast and rose polish. The clock ticked in even rhythm, and the tea tray waited with quiet promise. Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a kind smile and said the papers had arrived. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, knitting placed neatly beside her cup. She noticed the folded newspaper half hidden under the silver tray. Mrs. Bantry said she had not read much, only enough to see something dreadful. The headline spoke of tragic death at the fair. The words seemed large against the grey print. Mrs. Bantry sighed and poured the tea with a careful hand. She said the poor baker had not survived the night. Miss Marple stirred her cup and asked how people had taken the news. Mrs. Bantry said everyone talked, though none claimed to know the truth. The Reverend had visited the widow, and Dr. Haydock had been seen leaving quietly. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice. She said some whispered the baker had been poisoned, and others thought it was nonsense. Still, the talk spread faster than the rain itself. Miss Marple looked toward the window where droplets slid down in steady lines. She asked softly if the man had enemies. Mrs. Bantry said perhaps none. Though rivalry in baking could sharpen tempers, they spoke of Lucy, and how the girl had been pale at the fair. Mrs. Bantry said she felt sorry for her, caught in such talk. Miss Marple nodded and thought of the jar that had gone missing. Dr. Haydock arrived just then, shaking off his umbrella. He said he had stopped by for a check on Mrs. Bantry's roses, though his tone carried something else. Mrs. Bantry poured him tea and asked about the fair. He said quietly that the cause of death was uncertain. He had sent samples to the lab, though the signs pointed toward something bitter. Miss Marple noted the word bitter and the small pause that followed. She asked whether anyone had eaten the same tart. The doctor said several had, though only the deceased had fallen ill. That, he added, made it troubling. Miss Marple said perhaps the man had taken a larger slice. Mrs. Bantry asked if that mattered, and Miss Marple smiled faintly. She said proportions always matter when sweetness hides harm. The fire crackled softly, and Mrs. Bantry reached for the sugar tongs. The spoon tapped the edge of the cup, a light metallic sound. Miss Marple noticed the way the sugar clumped again, though the jar looked new. The doctor mentioned that Inspector Craddock had visited the grocer. He believed someone had purchased a small bottle of flavouring last week, under another name. Miss Marple lifted her brows slightly, but said nothing. Mrs. Bantry asked if Lucy had been questioned. The doctor said yes, though the girl was frightened more than guilty. He believed the matter would resolve quickly. Miss Marple said gossip seldom rests until truth is known. She folded her napkin neatly, and added that the fair had felt strange, even before the judging. Mrs. Bantry agreed, saying the air had seemed tense. The doctor finished his tea and rose to leave. He said he hoped rain would clear the air, though he doubted it would. Miss Marple watched him go and noted the way his hand lingered on the doorknob, thoughtful, restrained. When the door closed, the house grew still. The sound of rain filled the space like a calm heartbeat. Miss Marple looked again at the newspaper headline and tapped her finger once on the table. A small clue settled in her mind. The tart had been baked twice. She recalled Lucy's mention of it, said with offhand innocence. Why twice, she wondered, and for what reason? Evening light dimmed behind clouds, and the lamps glowed in steady halos. Miss Marple remained at Mrs. Bantry's until the talk drifted to weather. When she left, the road gleamed faintly, and the air smelled of wet earth. She walked home slowly, turning thoughts over like smooth stones. A man ill from one tart, a missing jar, and a twice-baked crust. She thought of domestic hands that move through habit, and one hand that meant harm. When she reached her cottage, the light inside was soft and amber. She placed her shawl by the chair and poured fresh tea. The kettle sighed, and she sat in her usual spot near the lace curtain. The doorbell rang once, light and hesitant. It was Lucy Harwood, eyes wide from sleepless worry. She asked if Miss Marple had a moment, and Miss Marple said she always had one for tea. Lucy sat, clutching her gloves. She said the inspector had visited again, asking about the sugar jar and the shop's deliveries. She feared he thought her uncle guilty. Miss Marple asked what her uncle said. Lucy said he was angry at the idea but too tired to argue. He said someone had borrowed a jar days ago and never returned it. Miss Marple offered her a cup and waited through the silence. Lucy said she had gone through the shop ledger again, but the ink on one page looked fresh. Miss Marple asked which page. Lucy said it was the one marked Saturday, extra preserves. Miss Marple asked if the handwriting looked different. Lucy said yes, heavier and darker than usual. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said she thought that might matter later. Lucy said people were avoiding her at the market. Mrs. Hartley had turned away, and even the vicar's maid looked uneasy. Miss Marple said, fear travels faster than guilt, but both tire quickly. Outside, the rain softened into drizzle, and the wind carried the scent of wet wood. Miss Marple told Lucy to keep calm and to bake as usual tomorrow. She said, routine protects the heart when tongues grow restless. Lucy thanked her and rose to leave. Miss Marple walked her to the door and saw the reflection of the lamp in the puddles. She thought of two truths, one whispered, one waiting. When the house grew quiet again, she returned to her chair. She lifted her knitting, though her eyes followed thoughts instead of threads. The cat stretched near the fire, and the kettle hummed low. She recalled the doctor's words, the sugar that clumped, and the jar that changed. She saw again the purple stain on the napkin, small, yet unshakable. Every detail felt connected by patience, not by chance. A small clue rested within her reach. The letter L on the ledger, written too tall for the grocer's hand. Miss Marple smiled, folded her work, and set the lamp lower. She thought of Mrs. Bantry's question at tea. Who would wish to poison a baker? Miss Marple believed the question was wrong. It should have been, who wished to ruin one. The clock marked each second with calm precision. The storm outside eased into quiet drizzle. Miss Marple looked toward her garden, where raindrops shone on the holly leaves. She said softly to herself that truth seldom hides forever. It waits until someone listens without noise. She listened, and the stillness seemed to answer. Chapter 3. The Late Evening Caller. The evening settled cool over St. Mary Mead, and windows glowed with warm light. Smoke drifted straight from the chimneys, and the sound of rain faded to a misty hush. Miss Marple sat by her hearth, knitting, resting like calm thought in her hands. The pattern was simple, a steady rhythm of loops and turns. Outside, a knock came at her door, soft, hesitant, and late. Lucy Harwood stood there, her cloak damp and her eyes wide. She said she hoped it was not too late to call. Miss Marple smiled gently and said the hour was perfect for tea. Lucy stepped inside and the warmth seemed to ease her trembling. She said Inspector Craddock had visited again and her uncle was angry. He said someone had spread a lie that he switched jars. Miss Marple poured tea and asked her to sit near the fire. She said warmth helps the mind as much as the hands. Lucy nodded and looked at the flickering flame. Lucy said the inspector found the grocer's receipt book. One page was torn and written over again. Her uncle swore he had not touched it. Still, people now crossed the street when he passed. Miss Marple said the village forgets kindness faster than gossip. She asked when Lucy last saw the missing jar. Lucy said she remembered it on a top shelf near the window. Miss Marple nodded. She asked what day sunlight struck that shelf most directly. Lucy said late afternoon, just before closing. Miss Marple looked thoughtful and asked if the curtains were ever drawn early. Lucy said sometimes when her uncle stepped out for errands. He always locked the till but left the shop lights burning. Miss Marple set her cup down and asked if the rival baker had ever visited at such an hour. Lucy hesitated, then said yes. One evening, near dusk, the air grew still in the small sitting room. The clock marked each passing second like a heartbeat. Miss Marple leaned back, knitting moving slowly through her fingers. She asked if Lucy had ever smelled almonds in the shop. Lucy said only once, and thought it came from a bottle of extract. Her uncle said it was old stock from last year. Miss Marple asked if the rival baker's wife ever visited. Lucy said no, though she had sent her son for bread once. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said boys notice less than mothers. Lucy said she feared her uncle would be arrested. She said she wished she could prove his innocence. Miss Marple replied softly that innocence often proves itself if one keeps still. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a single sound then gone. Miss Marple rose and closed the window latch. She looked out into the street, lamps burning dim behind fog. A shape passed the gate, shadow against shadow. Miss Marple noted the height, the pace, and the brief hesitation near the postbox. She said nothing, and the figure moved on. Lucy asked if she imagined things. Miss Marple said the mind never invents fear without reason, though the reason may be small. They returned to tea. The clock struck 9. A knock came again, firmer this time. Miss Marple opened the door. Inspector Craddock stood there, hat in hand, raincoat dark from drizzle. He said he was sorry for the hour, but needed to ask Lucy one more question. Miss Marple invited him in and poured another cup. Craddock thanked her with weary civility. He asked Lucy if her uncle ever sold leftover tarts after the fair. She said yes, some went to the grocer and one to the vicarage. Craddock nodded and said one of those tarts had been tested. Miss Marple asked if it showed poison. Craddock said no, none at all. Only the one served to the victim had traces of a bitter compound. Miss Marple looked into the fire and said quietly, "That intention sometimes misfires." Craddock looked puzzled, and Lucy stared down at her gloves. Craddock said someone must have handled that tart after it left the oven. He asked if Lucy or her uncle touched it again. Lucy shook her head. Miss Marple said gently that sometimes kindness changes a plate when no one is looking. She asked who arranged the display before judging. Lucy said Mrs. Hartley had helped because the grocer lent plates. Miss Marple nodded, and her eyes softened. She said Mrs. Hartley seemed an efficient woman. Craddock said she was, though lately too interested in small favours. The rain grew heavier and wind pressed at the window panes. Miss Marple said Lucy should stay the night. Lucy hesitated, then agreed. Craddock rose to leave, promising to return in the morning. He said the doctor would confirm the compound by dawn. Miss Marple said she would have the kettle on. When the door closed, Lucy sighed. She said she wished the truth would come quickly. Miss Marple said truth walks slowly but always finds its own door. The next morning came grey and cool. The air smelled of damp earth and fading rain. Miss Marple served breakfast simply: toast, jam and tea. Lucy looked better but quiet. She said she had dreamed of jars falling and shattering. Miss Marple said dreams tidy what the mind leaves scattered. After breakfast, they walked together to the bakery. The window glass fogged with steam, and the smell of bread filled the lane. Mr. Harwood stood behind the counter, pale but proud. He greeted Miss Marple kindly, though his voice carried fatigue. He said the inspector had already been by. He said they took a jar and a spoon for testing. Miss Marple asked if he minded. He said he only wished his name clear. She said names, like bread, rise again if the air is right. She asked if he had noticed anything missing. He said yes, a small cloth bag from the shelf behind the counter. It held sugar samples from a fair supplier. Miss Marple asked when he last saw it. He said 2 days before the fair, when Mrs. Hartley delivered flour. Lucy's eyes widened. She said Mrs. Hartley had offered to help unpack. Her uncle nodded slowly. He said she handled the shelves and said the jars looked dusty. Miss Marple turned to the shelf near the window. Dust lined every edge except one square patch. She traced it with her fingertip and saw where a jar once stood. A small clue gleamed in the daylight. A faint ring of syrup dried around that spot. She asked Lucy for a cloth and wiped gently. The mark smelled faintly of almonds. Inspector Craddock entered just then, brisk but polite. He said the doctor confirmed it. The poison was bitter almond extract mixed with sugar. Miss Marple looked toward the window, calm as always. Craddock said they traced the purchase to the grocer's shop. The signature on the ledger was false. Mrs. Hartley had written it. Lucy gasped. Her uncle's face softened with disbelief. Craddock said they would speak to her at once. Miss Marple asked if she might come along. At the shop, Mrs. Hartley stood behind the counter, arranging tins. She looked startled but composed. Craddock told her what they knew. She said she only helped as asked, and never meant harm. Miss Marple asked if she baked for the fair. Mrs. Hartley said yes, but only a simple sponge. Miss Marple asked if she shared her almond essence. Mrs. Hartley said she had with the other baker, for luck. Craddock asked where the bottle was now. Mrs. Hartley pointed to the cupboard. He opened it, and inside sat a bottle half empty and unlabelled. Miss Marple lifted it, uncorked the lid, and sniffed lightly. The scent burned faintly in the nose. She said gently that luck can turn when truth is stirred into sweetness. Mrs. Hartley looked down. She said the rival baker had mocked her cakes, and she wanted him to fail. She said she meant only to make him ill, not dead. Lucy stepped back, her face pale. Craddock said little, only took notes. Miss Marple said softly that spite bakes faster than remorse. They left the shop quietly. Rain began again, light and even. Lucy asked why Mrs. Hartley had confessed so easily. Miss Marple said guilt grows heavy when kindness stands nearby. They walked past the green, where children played despite the drizzle. Life had resumed its steady pace. Miss Marple said peace often returns without ceremony. At home, she poured tea for Lucy and herself. The fire burned low and the cat purred near the hearth. Miss Marple said there would be questions, but the truth was simple now. Lucy asked how she had known. Miss Marple said people leave traces where words pretend they do not. The syrup ring, the smell, the torn ledger, each spoke quietly. Lucy thanked her, eyes wet but relieved. Miss Marple said tears wash away nothing but noise. She handed her a clean napkin and smiled. When Lucy left, the cottage felt still again. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, counting stitches without hurry. The rain softened into a whisper against the glass. She thought of Mrs. Hartley. and how jealousy begins like a pinch of salt, small, unnoticed, yet powerful when stirred. She thought of Lucy, whose kindness might mend what bitterness had spoiled. Her eyes lifted toward the window, where faint light broke through clouds. She said softly that each wrong finds its cure in time and truth. Chapter 4. The jar on the shelf. The morning sun fell weak through the mist, and the air smelled faintly of rain. The village grocer's shop opened with the familiar creak of its wooden door. Miss Marple stepped inside, her umbrella neatly folded. The shop held rows of tins and jars, stacked in quiet order. A small bell above the door rang, and Mr. Sims, the grocer, looked up from his ledger. He greeted her with polite warmth, saying he had just brewed coffee. Miss Marple smiled, said she would not take long, and began to look at the shelves. Mrs. Hartley was there too, arranging jars near the window. She seemed pale, her eyes downcast. The air between the three felt cautious. Mr. Sims asked Miss Marple if she wanted her usual tea leaves. She said yes, but added that she was also looking for blackberry preserves. He said the last batch had gone quickly after the fair. Miss Marple said she thought there might still be one jar left, perhaps misplaced. Mr. Sims frowned, said he would check the back shelves. Mrs. Hartley continued to dust, her hands moving too quickly. Miss Marple followed Mr. Sims to the storeroom. The light there was dim, and dust hung in soft beams. Jars lined every wall, labels in fading ink. She ran her finger along a shelf and felt a clean gap. Mr. Sims said he had not noticed that space before. Miss Marple asked if the shelf was cleaned recently. He said Mrs. Hartley had offered to help on Thursday when he was busy with deliveries. She nodded, and her eyes moved to a jar set apart from the rest. Its label was slightly crooked, the glue at its edge uneven. She asked about it, and Mr. Sims said it came from the Harwood's bakery. He added that the jar had been returned late, after the fair, though no one recalled who brought it. Miss Marple bent closer, noticing a thin layer of dust except for a fresh fingerprint near the lid. She said gently that it was a tidy shop. Though dust tells quiet stories, Mr. Sims chuckled nervously and said he tried his best. Miss Marple smiled, asked for a half-pound of sugar, and waited while he weighed it. As she waited, she looked again at the crooked jar. The handwriting on its label was darker, heavier than usual. She thought of Lucy's remark about the ledger entry and a broken pen. Mr. Sims returned with her parcel. Miss Marple thanked him, then asked who had keys to the back door. He said only himself and Mrs. Hartley. She nodded slowly, saying, "Trust was a delicate thing in trade." Mrs. Hartley entered, wiping her hands. She said she was stepping out for a few minutes. Her voice trembled just enough to notice. Miss Marple smiled and said she hoped the day would stay fine. When Mrs. Hartley left, Mr. Sims sighed. He said she had been nervous since the inspector's visit. He said he thought she meant no harm, but she talked too freely. Miss Marple asked if she had mentioned the fair. Mr. Sims said yes, and that she had spoken of the tarts more than once, saying things might have gone differently. Miss Marple thanked him, paid for her sugar, and turned to go. At the door, she paused and looked again toward the crooked label. It caught the light from the window, a soft gleam over glass. Outside, the street smelled of rain-soaked earth. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the lane. Miss Marple walked slowly, thoughts unfolding like quiet thread. Back at her cottage, she set the sugar on the table and took her seat by the window. Her knitting lay untouched. She watched sparrows hop near the hedge and thought about jars, labels, and ledgers. The pattern in her mind grew clearer: a missing jar, a switched lid, and two hands too eager to help. She wondered which of those hands trembled more, the one that hid or the one that feared discovery. The next morning came bright, the clouds thin and white. Miss Marple walked to the vicarage garden. For tea with Reverend and Mrs. Clement, roses still dripped from the earlier rain. Mrs. Clement said she had heard dreadful talk about Mrs. Hartley. Miss Marple said talk often follows the truth too closely to be kind. Reverend Clement asked if the inspector had found new evidence. She said quietly that sometimes evidence hides where it is tidied away. She told them of the jar, the dust, and the handwriting. The Reverend frowned, saying such deceit seemed unlikely of a shop girl. Miss Marple said temptation does not belong to one class or another. She said envy and pride visit every doorstep, often carrying small parcels. Mrs. Clement sighed and poured more tea. After tea, Miss Marple walked toward the bakery again. Lucy waved from the doorway, flour dusting her apron. The shop smelled of bread and warmth. Miss Marple asked if her uncle was well. Lucy said yes, though still quiet. She said he felt guilty that Mrs. Hartley might be blamed. Miss Marple said guilt sometimes belongs to the wrong person, but seldom for long. They spoke of the fair, the jars, and the rumours that still circled. Lucy said she wished the village would forget. Miss Marple said, forgetting is easier than forgiving, though both take time. She asked if Lucy had ever noticed a customer who stayed after closing. Lucy said once, Mrs. Hartley returned claiming she lost a glove. She stayed near the shelves while Lucy cleaned. Miss Marple asked if she found the glove. Lucy said no, and later realized Mrs. Hartley left, carrying a small parcel. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes mild but steady. She asked what kind of paper wrapped the parcel. Lucy said brown paper with a blue string, the kind used for sugar sacks. The bell above the bakery door rang. Inspector Craddock stepped in, greeting them both. He said new evidence had turned up. A bottle found behind the grocer's shed, label soaked but faintly marked almond essence. Miss Marple asked if Mrs. Hartley denied it. Craddock said she claimed it was old stock discarded months ago. Miss Marple said sometimes what we discard stays near enough to return. Lucy asked if that proved anything. Miss Marple said proof is only a word for what everyone already suspects. Craddock smiled, saying she always spoke in riddles. She said riddles keep minds patient, and patience finds the truth. Craddock said the doctor confirmed again that only one tart was tainted. He said he still wondered why the victim alone had suffered. Miss Marple said perhaps he ate the wrong tart, or perhaps the right one. He looked puzzled, but she did not explain further. Lucy watched her, unsure whether to ask. Miss Marple simply said, time will settle it. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the grocer's shop alone. Mr. Sims was sweeping the floor. She asked politely if she might see the crooked jar once more. He handed it to her, and she turned it in her hands. The light caught the edge where glue thickened. She peeled a corner gently and saw another label beneath, faded, older, and marked almond. Mr. Sims gasped. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said sometimes one truth hides behind another, just as people do. She asked him to keep the jar safe for the inspector. She left the shop quietly. Outside, the sun had dipped low and the air held the faint scent of bread. She walked home slowly, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones in rhythm with her thoughts. At her cottage, she placed a fresh jar of jam on the table. She labelled it carefully, straight and true. Then she sat by the fire, her knitting smooth in her hands. She thought about how deceit begins with a small tilt, a crooked word, a false kindness, a jar just slightly out of line. And she thought how truth waits, patient and exact. Chapter 5. Tea at the vicarage. The afternoon sun rested softly on the vicarage garden. Rain had washed the air clean, and roses bent under beads of water. Mrs. Clement arranged the tea service on a low table near the lilac hedge. Miss Marple arrived with measured steps, her shawl folded neatly over her arm. The Reverend stood by the gate, trimming the hedge with calm precision. He greeted her warmly, saying she was just in time for the second pot. They sat together beneath the shade of a broad elm. The garden smelled of mint and damp soil. Birds called quietly from the branches. Mrs. Clement poured tea and spoke of the fair again. She said the village still whispered about Mrs. Hartley. Some pitied her, some did not. Miss Marple said pity sometimes comes too late to be useful. The Reverend nodded, saying the Lord's work often moves in quiet ways. The Reverend asked if Inspector Craddock had found enough evidence. Miss Marple said he had found much, though perhaps not enough of the right kind. Mrs. Clement looked curious, asking what she meant. Miss Marple said sometimes facts shine too brightly and truth hides in their shadow. She stirred her cup once. Slowly, the talk drifted to forgiveness. The Reverend said he hoped Mrs. Hartley would speak honestly at last. Mrs. Clement said she wished the village would let the matter rest. Miss Marple said rest comes when the heart accepts what the mind already knows. A soft wind moved through the hedge. The sound of bees hummed in gentle rhythm. The tea steamed faintly and the cups clinked as they were lifted. Mrs. Clement offered a plate of small cakes. Miss Marple chose one, examined it lightly and said it was perfectly baked. The Reverend laughed and said they had taken no chances this time. He said Lucy had sent a loaf from the bakery that morning, a gesture of peace. Miss Marple smiled, saying kindness always bakes better than revenge. They spoke of Lucy's uncle, how he had closed the shop early the past few days. The Reverend said people would forgive him soon. Miss Marple said forgiveness seldom waits for proof. Mrs. Clement asked if Miss Marple still believed the poison was not meant for the man who died. Miss Marple looked toward the roses and said the target was likely another, but chance had played its hand. The Reverend frowned slightly. He said such talk sounded grim. Miss Marple said life's lessons seldom arrive by cheerful routes. The Reverend poured more tea, and silence stretched comfortably between them. From the road beyond the hedge came voices. Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock passing by. Mrs. Bantry called a greeting and said the doctor had been summoned again to the grocer's. Something about another fainting spell. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. She asked if it was Mrs. Hartley. Mrs. Bantry nodded, saying the poor woman had collapsed near the till. Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. She said sometimes truth comes to those who can no longer speak. The Reverend rose, saying he would go at once to offer prayer. Miss Marple said she would accompany him. They walked together down the lane, where puddles reflected broken light. The grocer's shop stood open, the bell above the door still trembling from the last visitor. Dr. Haydock was inside, bent over Mrs. Hartley, who sat pale on a chair. Mr. Sims stood nearby holding a glass of water. The air smelled faintly of almonds again. Miss Marple's eyes moved across the counter to a small box beside the scale. The lid was ajar, and inside lay folded papers. She stepped closer, asking softly if the woman could speak. Mrs. Hartley opened her eyes weakly. She whispered something about the jar and the letter. Miss Marple nodded and told her to rest. The Reverend said a brief prayer, his voice low and steady. When the doctor left, Miss Marple remained behind. She asked Mr. Sims about the box near the counter. He said it held old letters from suppliers, nothing more. She lifted one corner gently. The top envelope was addressed in the same heavy hand she had seen on the jar's label. It read, "Payment enclosed for discretion kept." She folded it closed and asked Mr. Sims if he had seen it before. He said no and looked uneasy. Miss Marple said quietly that debts come in many forms, some not measured in money. She thanked him, left the shop, and walked toward the green. The Reverend joined her, asking if she had learned anything. She said only that mercy is sometimes the last truth to appear. They reached the vicarage again as the sun dipped low. Mrs. Clement met them at the gate, asking how Mrs. Hartley fared. Miss Marple said she would recover, though her peace might take longer. They returned to the table, still set with tea things. The cups had cooled, and the cakes looked untouched. Miss Marple poured a little fresh tea, its warmth returning to her fingers. The Reverend asked softly if guilt could ever be forgiven. Miss Marple said forgiveness is easier for those who understand why they erred. She said most sins begin as fear, not malice. Mrs. Clement sighed, saying fear visits every home. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said that was why tea and talk are useful. They give fear something gentle to do. The cat from the garden climbed onto Miss Marple's lap. She stroked it absently, eyes thoughtful. She said quietly that the truth had begun to settle. The Reverend asked if justice would follow. She said justice walks slower than rumour, but lasts longer. The cat purred, and the garden wind carried the scent of wet earth once more. As she rose to leave, Mrs. Clement pressed a small packet of scones into her hand. Miss Marple thanked her, saying, kindness tastes better when shared. She walked home along the quiet lane, where lamplight shimmered on puddles. The houses stood peaceful, smoke rising in narrow plumes. At her gate, she paused. Somewhere far down the road, a carriage rolled away. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, of letters and jars, of debts and remorse. Inside her cottage, she placed the scones on the table and set the kettle to boil. She added one stitch to her knitting, then another, each as neat as the last. She whispered softly that truth needs patience and hearts need gentleness. The kettle began to sing, and the flame beneath it glowed steady. Chapter 6. The letter in the drawer. Morning light slanted across the bakery windows, soft and golden. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, and the steady hum of the oven warmed the walls. Miss Marple stood by the counter, her shawl folded neatly, eyes wandering across the shelves. Lucy Harwood arranged buns on a tray, her movements careful and subdued. She said her uncle was in the back room, sorting receipts. Miss Marple nodded and said, "Order brings peace to troubled minds." The bell above the door chimed as Inspector Craddock entered, hat in hand. He greeted them both and said he came only to collect a few small details. His tone was polite, but held quiet purpose. Mr. Harwood joined them, his hands dusted with flour. He said he hoped the matter would soon end. Craddock said it nearly had, though a few loose ends remained. Miss Marple smiled faintly, saying loose ends always tell their own stories. Craddock asked about a missing receipt for flour delivered last week. Mr. Harwood opened a drawer beneath the till, searching through envelopes. Miss Marple's eyes followed his hand, calm, practiced, yet slightly hesitant. He pulled out a small stack of folded papers. Among them, a half-burned letter slipped free and fell onto the counter. Its edge was charred, its ink blurred by heat. Miss Marple looked at it quietly. Mr. Harwood frowned, said it must have been rubbish. He reached to discard it, but Miss Marple asked softly if she might see it first. He hesitated, then nodded. The letter's handwriting was familiar, thick, uneven, the same as the label she had peeled from the crooked jar. The words read only partly clear. Payment received. Your assistants noted. Miss Marple asked where it came from. Mr. Harwood said he could not recall, perhaps an old supplier. Craddock leaned closer, reading the visible line. He said it matched a note found near Mrs. Hartley's counter. Miss Marple asked if the rest had been burned. Mr. Harwood said yes, in the oven yesterday. He said he thought it worthless, just old correspondence. Miss Marple nodded and said truth often begins in ashes. Craddock asked to take the letter for evidence. Mr. Harwood agreed, though his face turned pale. Lucy watched silently, her hands twisting her apron. She asked if her uncle was in danger again. Craddock said no, though more questions might follow. Miss Marple touched Lucy's shoulder gently and said fear makes answers harder to hear. She asked Lucy if she remembered anyone near the till last Thursday. Lucy said Mrs. Hartley had fetched change while her uncle was in the storeroom. Craddock asked whether Mrs. Hartley had handled any letters. Lucy said she had taken one envelope, saying she needed to compare handwriting for a grocery order. Mr. Harwood remembered, and his expression tightened. Miss Marple said gently that small lies usually travel in polite company. She asked if Mrs. Hartley had returned the letter. Lucy said no, but later she had seen ashes in the bin near the back door. The shop felt still. Outside, a cart rattled down the lane, and the bell over the door trembled slightly. Miss Marple looked at the till drawer again. Its brass handle gleamed with fresh polish. She asked Lucy who cleaned it. Lucy said her uncle had done so the night before, to occupy his mind. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze thoughtful. She saw faint traces of soot near the hinge. A small clue lay in plain sight, a smudge of ink shaped like half a loop, the same kind found on the jar label. She pressed a handkerchief lightly against it, noting the mark. She said quietly that people often hide what they cannot explain, though truth seldom stays buried. Craddock watched her, curiosity softening his voice. He said she seemed to know more than she shared. Miss Marple smiled kindly and said she merely listened to what objects remembered. The afternoon brought thin sunlight and long shadows through the bakery window. Business had slowed. Lucy swept the floor, humming faintly to herself. Miss Marple remained seated, knitting resting on her lap. Inspector Craddock returned with a small folder. He said Mrs. Hartley had admitted taking letters for safekeeping. She claimed she feared the rival baker meant harm, and she wanted proof. Miss Marple asked whether she had said why she burned them. Craddock said she thought it was safer once suspicion turned toward her. Miss Marple said fire clears guilt but never purifies it. Lucy asked what the letters meant. Craddock said they suggested a payment from the rival baker to silence her. Miss Marple said silence is rarely sold cheaply. She looked toward the window, the light dimming slightly. Mr. Harwood brought tea for them all. His hands shook just enough to spill a few drops. Miss Marple took her cup and said softly that peace requires steadiness, not haste. She asked if he had written to anyone before the fair. He said no, though one letter had arrived unsigned. It had warned that his might not win. He had ignored it. Craddock asked to see it. Mr. Harwood said he had thrown it away. Miss Marple said perhaps he had, but perhaps not entirely. She asked if he emptied his drawer completely. He looked uncertain, then checked. A thin slip of paper remained, folded small, edges dark with soot. He opened it. The handwriting was again the same, bold, slanted, too heavy for his own. The note read, "You will regret crossing me." Miss Marple said quietly that regret often finds those who expect triumph. Craddock sighed and said the case had grown stranger. Miss Marple said human nature seldom follows neat lines. She asked if the rival baker's wife had been questioned. Craddock said yes, and she denied knowing anything. The clock struck 3. The smell of bread softened as the ovens cooled. Miss Marple rose and looked toward the back door. The bucket near it held grey ashes, some flecked with unburned paper. She asked Lucy for tongs and lifted one piece carefully. The fragment bore ink marks and part of a name, Sims. She said softly that perhaps not all the truth was lost to smoke. Craddock said he would send it for analysis. Miss Marple said to let it rest on his conscience instead. He smiled tiredly and said her conscience was sharper than any test. When he left, Miss Marple and Lucy sat in gentle silence. The afternoon air turned cool again, carrying the faint smell of yeast and ash. Lucy said she did not understand why people cause harm when life offers so much kindness. Miss Marple said, kindness offends some hearts because it reminds them what they lack. She said jealousy is only love turned the wrong way around. Lucy nodded, her eyes soft with tears. Miss Marple passed her a napkin and said, sorrow cleans more than tears do. They tidied the counter, folding the papers neatly. Miss Marple took her shawl, preparing to leave. She paused at the door, looking once more at the drawer. She said softly that drawers are like people, full of what they hide until someone looks kindly inside. Lucy smiled faintly and said she would remember that. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lane. The sky was pale, the fields calm, and a few birds flew low over the hedges. She felt the case nearing its close, yet not finished. At her cottage, she placed her knitting beside the fire. She added a few stitches, then stopped. Her eyes held the same quiet certainty as when she solved small patterns long ago. She said aloud, though no one heard, that evil often starts from hurt pride and ends with quiet ruin. She stirred her tea and watched the ripples fade. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Tart. The village hall was bright with morning light and full of quiet tension. Wooden benches creaked softly as people took their seats. The air carried the smell of polish, damp coats, and faint nervousness. At the front sat Inspector Craddock beside Dr. Haydock. The Reverend Clement and Mrs. Bantry occupied a row near the front. Miss Marple took her place near the aisle, her knitting in her lap, eyes calm and steady. The inquest had drawn nearly everyone from St. Mary Mead. They came with soft voices and lowered glances, as if politeness might soften curiosity. Inspector Craddock stood and spoke quietly. He reviewed the events of the fair, the illness, and the discovery of the poison. His words were factual, unhurried, and without emphasis. He said the compound found in the tart was bitter almond extract mixed with sugar. He said it had been added after baking. Miss Marple listened without moving her hands. Dr. Haydock confirmed the findings. He said the poison was not in the jam itself but brushed lightly across the crust, a small act requiring calm and intent. Murmurs filled the hall, soft as wind through reeds. Miss Marple's gaze rested on Mrs. Hartley seated in the back. The woman's face looked tired, her hands twisting a handkerchief until it tore. Craddock said evidence suggested Mrs. Hartley obtained the extract, but her motive remained uncertain. He said she had confessed to anger, not to murder. Miss Marple raised her eyes. She said softly that anger seldom begins as evil. It begins as fear of being forgotten. The hall grew silent at her voice, though she had spoken almost kindly. The coroner nodded, asking if she wished to add anything. She said perhaps a few small details might clear the picture. Craddock looked half expectant, half resigned. She said the rival baker had mocked Mrs. Hartley for her cakes. He had laughed in public, and she had answered in kind. The village thought it banter, but pride had been wounded. Miss Marple said someone like Mrs. Hartley, proud and overlooked, might wish to teach a lesson, a harmless lesson, a day's sickness perhaps. But such things never stay harmless. The coroner asked how the poison had reached the wrong tart. Miss Marple said the jars had been switched. The tainted crust was brushed for one person, but another took the plate. The hall stirred again. Miss Marple continued, her tone mild. She said Mrs. Hartley had meant the poison for the rival baker, but Lucy's uncle had rearranged the plates before judging. She paused. The light through the window struck her face gently. Her expression was neither triumph nor judgment. Mrs. Hartley began to weep quietly. She said she had only wanted him to lose, not to die. Her voice cracked on the word wanted. Miss Marple said softly that want and harm often sit too close together. She asked no more. The coroner sighed, and the hall fell into stillness. Craddock looked weary, as though truth itself weighed too much to hold. The coroner thanked Miss Marple and declared the death a tragic misadventure caused by recklessness. The words felt gentle, almost merciful. Mrs. Hartley bowed her head. The Reverend murmured a prayer. Outside, church bells began to ring the noon hour. Miss Marple rose slowly, folding her knitting. The thread trailed for a moment, then disappeared neatly into the bundle. She said to Craddock that truth never surprises her. People do. He smiled faintly and said he doubted she ever missed much. She replied that one only sees clearly when one does not wish to. He laughed quietly and said she was impossible. She said that was her greatest virtue. After the inquest, the crowd drifted into the square. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant baking. Mrs. Bantry joined Miss Marple, saying the whole business left her heart heavy. Miss Marple said, "Heaviness passes if one lets it." Mrs. Bantry asked if she pitied Mrs. Hartley. Miss Marple said she pitied anyone who cannot forgive themselves. They walked together toward the bakery. Lucy stood at the doorway, pale but smiling. She said her uncle had gone to rest, and the ovens were quiet for once. Miss Marple said quiet was sometimes the best sound. She asked Lucy if she felt easier now. Lucy said she did, though she still dreamed of jars and spoons. Inside the bakery, the air was warm again. Fresh dough waited on the counter, and sunlight painted lines across the tiles. Miss Marple said the place looked alive again. Lucy thanked her, saying she did not know how to repay her kindness. Miss Marple said truth was payment enough. She said every kindness leaves its own echo. Inspector Craddock entered briefly, hat still in hand. He said Mrs. Hartley had been taken home under watch, but no charge would follow. Miss Marple nodded, saying punishment often lives within. Craddock said he still wondered how she had seen the connection so early. Miss Marple said she had smelled almonds twice and heard fear once. Both were stronger than proof. He laughed quietly, thanked her again, and left. Lucy asked what she meant about fear. Miss Marple said fear always visits the guilty before it visits the innocent. They sat a while longer, drinking tea in gentle silence. Outside, the church bell struck 1. The air carried the scent of blackberries from a nearby hedge. Lucy said she would never bake a tart without remembering this. Miss Marple said memory is a fine ingredient, if used sparingly. When Miss Marple returned home, her cottage felt still and kind. She lit the fire, set her knitting aside, and looked toward the window. The world seemed smaller now, as if it had exhaled. She thought about Mrs. Hartley's tears, the rival baker's pride, and Lucy's quiet endurance. She thought about how small things, a spoon, a jar, a label, can hold the shape of human folly. The kettle began to hum softly. Miss Marple poured her tea, stirred once, and watched the swirl fade. The flame under the pot flickered, steady and bright. She whispered to herself that truth, like heat, must be gentle or it burns too much. Outside, the rain returned, fine and slow. The cat curled by the hearth, sighing into sleep. Miss Marple folded her hands and watched the fire settle into calm glow. Chapter 28. Blackberry shadows. Autumn came quietly to St. Mary Mead. The hedges turned dark with ripe berries, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cool earth. The sky held a calm grey that suited the village well. The bakery door stood open again. Fresh loaves cooled on the sill, and Lucy arranged them with steady hands. People had begun to return, one by one, with soft words and small smiles. Miss Marple stopped by each morning for her bread. She asked about the weather, about the cat, about the little repairs on the window. Lucy always smiled, though her eyes stayed thoughtful. The village no longer whispered, at least not loudly. Gossip had softened into story, and story into memory. Life had folded the tragedy into its daily rhythm, as life always does. One afternoon, the Reverend came by the bakery. He asked Lucy to bake for the church supper. She agreed, saying she would make apple tarts this time, not blackberry. Miss Marple smiled at that choice. Mrs. Bantry visited too, bringing cut flowers. She said it was good to see the ovens warm again. Lucy thanked her, and her uncle nodded from behind the counter. Outside, children gathered near the hedges, picking berries with stained fingers. Their laughter carried across the street, light and untroubled. Miss Marple watched them from the bench near the green. Her knitting needles moved softly, silver against pale wool. The world seemed in rhythm again, a slower, kinder rhythm. Dr. Haydock passed by, tipping his hat. He said the village looked alive once more. Miss Marple said life prefers order to chaos, but sometimes needs a little of both to grow. Evening light spread like honey across the lanes. The sound of distant bells floated through the air. Miss Marple rose, folded her knitting, and began her walk home. The wind carried the scent of berries again, sweet, slightly sharp. She paused by the hedge, brushing her hand against a cluster. The stain left on her fingers was dark and soft. She thought of the blackberry tart, and how sweetness had once hidden sorrow. She thought how forgiveness had grown slowly, like fruit ripening under time. The cottage waited as always, quiet and warm. The fire burned low and the clock ticked in slow companionship. Miss Marple set her shawl on the chair and prepared her evening tea. The cat stretched near the hearth, blinking at the flame. The sound of boiling water filled the room, calm and familiar. Miss Marple poured the tea, added milk, and sat by the window. Outside, dusk settled across the village. Lamps glowed in windows, each like a small promise against darkness. The bakery light shone faintly at the corner of the lane. She sipped her tea and thought of Lucy, the Reverend, and Mrs. Hartley. She hoped each had found a way to rest their hearts, some through forgiveness, some through work, some through silence. She took up her knitting and resumed the pattern she had paused days ago. The wool looped softly through her fingers, each stitch quiet as breath. She said to herself that every mystery ends where patience begins. That truth, once spoken kindly, loses its sharpness, that people heal best when no one is watching. A log shifted in the fire. Sparks rose briefly, then faded. The warmth filled the room again, the way calm fills an old wound. From the distance came the sound of the church bell marking 8. Miss Marple smiled and placed her knitting aside. Her hands rested still on her lap. She thought of the fair, the laughter, the jar, the spoon, the letter. Each detail felt like part of a pattern long completed. Outside, rain began once more, fine and even. The sound merged with the ticking clock and the soft hum of the fire. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, listening. Then she whispered to the quiet room that every sweet thing carries a trace of bitterness, and every sin a hint of sorrow. The cat purred softly as if in agreement. Miss Marple smiled faintly and lifted her cup once more. The tea had cooled, but she drank it anyway for comfort rather than taste. The candle on the table burned with a steady flame. Its light touched the lace curtains, the old clock, and her folded shawl. The world outside dimmed into calm grey, and peace returned to St. Mary Mead once again. And so, dear listener, Miss Marple and the poison in the Blackberry Tart draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame glows steadily again. Its light rests gently on the revealed truth. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes. Each stitch reflects the tangled hearts of humankind. Threads once crossed now find their shape again. Outside, rain whispers against the window, soft as memory. The tea has cooled, the fire has lowered, and the cat dreams near the hearth. The village sleeps beneath calm skies where no gossip stirs and no harm lingers. Truth has done its work, not loudly, but completely. Forgiveness breathes again in the air, light as smoke after the storm. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.